Difference matters, but whenever we are exposed to more difference, we tend to highlight them and so they tend to cause troubles. Being exposed to different cultural beliefs and practices, for example, does not automatically mean we understand these beliefs and practices. More often than not, we find it hard to communicate across them or at least appreciate them. Communication troubles may arise now that people communicate across cultures more than ever before. Learning about differences and why they matter will help us be more competent communicators. So folks, let's talk about intercultural communication. Intercultural communication is communication between people with different cultural identities such as race, gender, sexuality, and ability. According to Martin and Nakayama, one reason we should study intercultural communication is to foster greater self-awareness. How so? Our thought process on things is often focused on others, meaning that others' culture is what stands out in our perception. However, as we understand other cultures and perspectives, we become more aware of our own culture. We step out of our comfortable, typical frame of reference. It's like seeing the world through different lenses. As a result of becoming more self-aware, we may also become more ethical communicators because we begin to challenge our ethnocentrism or our tendency to view our own culture as superior to those of others. In this video, we'll take a dialectical approach to capture the dynamism of intercultural communication. When we say dialectic, we look into relationship between two opposing concepts that constantly push and pull one another. In simpler words, a dialectical approach helps us realize that our experiences often occur in between two different phenomena. Thus, intercultural communication transpires as a dynamic in betweenness and not as dichotomies. So let's better understand intercultural communication by examining 6 dialectics as discussed by the University of Minnesota. The cultural individual dialectic captures the interplay between pattern behaviors learned from a cultural group and individual behaviors that may be variations on or counter to those of a larger culture. This dialectic is useful because it helps us account for exceptions to cultural norms. For example, we Filipinos are known for our hospitality, but let's say I'm an individual who doesn't really like entertaining visitors or welcoming guests to my home. Does this mean we are not hospitable people? There's a person who only follows health protocols, that's why they're not open to visits, come from an inhospitable culture? No, neither the behaviors of a small percentage of individuals nor occasional situational choices constitute a cultural pattern. The personal-contextual dialectic highlights the connection between our personal patterns of and preferences for communicating and how various contexts influence the personal. In some cases, our communication patterns and preferences will stay the same across many contexts. In other cases, a shift in context may lead us to alter communication and adapt. For example, my teaching style can be highly influenced by my personal preferences and by the different contexts in which I teach. Personally, I'm not the very formal type of teacher and I speak more casually than formally or technically. But this level of formality may change depending on where or who I'm teaching. Am I in the academic setup? Am I on TikTok? Am I with foreign students? Am I a resource speaker? Contexts are more likely to influence our communication than personal preferences. The differences, similarities dialectic allows us to examine how we are simultaneously similar to and different from others. It is easy to set up the dichotomies us and them, but as we said, we do not allow for dichotomies, right? Because focusing too much on differences polarizes groups that actually have something in common. For instance, there's this book called Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus, which makes it seem like men and women aren't even from the same planet. We've long had this notion that men and women are wired to communicate differently. However, according to Allen, the overwhelming majority of current research on gender and communication finds that while there are differences between how men and women communicate, there are far more similarities. Meanwhile, the opposite is also true. Focusing too much on similarities overlooks important variations within a group. The static dynamic dialectic suggests that culture and communication change over time, yet often appear to be and are experienced as stable. Although it is true that our cultural beliefs and practices are rooted in the past, cultural categories like race and gender have changed dramatically. For example, while generally the Philippines still displays a very conservative culture, people are now becoming more and more sensitive to the culture of the LGBTQ community. Some cultural values remain relatively consistent over time, which allows us to make some generalizations about a culture. The history or past to present future dialectic reminds us to understand that while current cultural conditions are important and that our actions now will inevitably affect our future, those conditions are not without a history. We always view history through the lens of the present. Perhaps no example is more entrenched in our past and avoided in our present than the history of human rights violations during the martial law. When the subject of compensation for the descendants of martial law victims comes up, people would say, "We never violated any rights. Why should I even have to care about this now?" Statements like this don't acknowledge that the effects of martial law and the culture of injustice still remain today, and that the consequences of such a long and unjust era of our history don't disappear over the course of a few generations. The privileges disadvantages dialectic captures the complex interrelation of unearned systematic advantages and disadvantages that operate among our various identities. Our cultures and identities have certain privileges and/or disadvantages because our identities are complex. No one is completely privileged and no one is completely disadvantaged. For example, a white woman who comes from a middle-class background and has a high degree of education can enjoy much privilege. However, gender inequality is still very real, and as a female, she can still earn less than men and face difficulties in getting a job. Worse, there could be situations in which her abilities can be questioned just because she is a woman. As technologies have shrunken the world and changes in demographic and political aspects of culture and communication brought attention to cultural differences, we have become more integrated in terms of cultural identities. Intercultural communication helps us be more critical thinkers and sensitively competent communicators in a changing world.